the information today in this presentation and accompanying materials is intended for informational purposes and does not necessarily reflect the views or the opinions of the University of Kentucky Human Development Institute or its individual employees. Although we make every attempt to provide accessible, accurate, and current information, no guarantees are made to that effect. I'd like to extend an invitation for you to join us in our next employment seminar series on September 27, where we will discuss universal design to promote mental wellness in the workplace. And our subject matter expert is Dr. Phil Rumrell from HDI in Retain, Kentucky. And this information will be in our chat along with today's resources for our presentation. Okay, so last housekeeping item, just as the objectives that we're going to talk about today, and then we'll introduce Steve and get started. So we are going to define workplace safety, and we're going to talk about workplace safety myths and help to dispel those myths. And then we're going to share ways that you can create a safety culture within your workplace. All right, so now it is with my pleasure that I welcome our expert today, Steve Thompson, who is an expert in workplace safety, loss control, and ergonomics. As a safety professional and subject matter expert for over 2 decades, Steve is dedicated to saving lives, preventing injuries and illness, and protecting clients from harm. Steve is Senior Vice President at Aspen Risk Management Group, Ergo Healthy, a TriStar company, and he holds his certifications in Associate Risk Management, Certified Construction Safety Health Compliance Officer, Certified Construction, Certified Construction Safety Health Compliance Officer under the Association of Safety Health Environmental Professionals, Certified Occupational Safety Specialist, American Council for Construction Education, and Certified Safety Health Compliance Officer with the International Association of Safety Health Environmental Professionals. Additionally, Steve was recently awarded the Safety Professional of the Year for Alaska, California, Hawaii, Washington, and Oregon. So, wow, that's a lot. And thank you so much for sharing your expertise and time with us today, Steve.
Thank you, Kimberly.
I also want to share, and this is also in our resources, Steve is the author of the book pictured here, Workplace Safety, a guide for small and mid-sized companies. And we are going to use this book as a model for our discussion today. And just out of curiosity, I mean, I know you have had a lot of experience. What prompted you to author a book on workplace safety?
Oh, it's one of those stories that only can be, you know, it's a story that's created. There's probably a myth behind it, but I had a friend of mine in the safety field that was too busy. And she said, hey, I have this company, this publisher that wants to publish a safety book. And then the publisher was purchased by Wiley, which is a very large publishing house. And before you know it, we had a book coming together. So it was one of those just miracle events.
Awesome. Well, I'm thankful, as I'm sure many people are who have had the opportunity to read your book and learn from it, that you did that. So thank you for sharing that story as well.
Well, thank you, Kimberly. We usually recommend reading it at bedtime because it'll put you right to sleep. You know, safety will do that to you.
Not true. I did download it and have been enjoying it on Kindle. So
great.
Not true, but I appreciate your humility.
All right.
So let's get started by talking about workplace safety. And can you tell us how you define workplace safety?
Great question. But before we begin, I just wanted to say a couple things.
Sure.
First, I love the mission at, Retain, Kentucky, and your program, because it's all focused on one thing, and that's helping people return to work. And no matter what that status looks like. So To me, workplace safety is essentially saving lives and preventing injuries and illnesses. It's no more complicated than that. Now, granted, you love to see a collective effort, creating an environment where people can work without unnecessary risks or hazards, because we know there are risks and hazards associated with work. So I like to look at that again as workplace safety is saving lives and preventing injuries and illnesses.
Okay. Well, that's a great definition, and thank you for also, applauding Retain. Obviously, we're all very passionate about what we do, and thank you for taking time to recognize us and make that link between workplace safety and Retain. We're going to
Sure.
go ahead and kind of take it a step further and talk about the key players who ensure safety in the workplace. So tell us who you feel should be responsible for that.
I think most of us on the call, and I think you'd agree, Kimberly, that it's a shared commitment. This is not a one-way street, as it relates to the responsibilities for safety. It is among all levels of an organization, from top management to frontline staff. Everyone has a role. I look at it as either identifying or addressing and preventing potential hazards. So although companies like to say it all starts at the top, I know that you and I talked before about this, Kimberly, that programs can start on the front lines. There are grassroots safety programs that can begin. So it's a shared commitment, and it's generally among, again, all levels of an organization.
Yeah, that's a great point. And, I've, as a case manager for a long time, worked with individuals who, were supervisors or frontline workers, and really them being accountable for their workplace safety was a huge part of how that organization defined workplace safety and how it was implemented, and what their safety numbers were. Probably went to the OSHA bottom line too, right? So it is very important. And I know we have folks on this call from all different perspectives: workforce professionals, healthcare providers, employers, and potentially even participants of Retain or other programs. And so I really like how you express that safety is everybody's responsibility, and everybody needs to be accountable for their personal safety and the safety of those around them as well.
Yeah, great point, Kimberly. And I think that, as a consultant working in this industry now for almost 20 years, every organization has unique ways to develop safety. It's not all the same at each organization. So that whole concept that it has to be one way and not another, we all know that every organization's unique and different, and so you've got to look at safety in the uniqueness of the way that company is structured. So that's why the responsibility ends up could be many different levels of staffing in an organization. So we're in agreement on that one.
Sounds good. Well, there are probably general rules that can be followed. It sounds like it's definitely not a one size fits all type of thing. So one of the things that we're talking a lot more about within industry, and I get our survey information oftentimes following our employment seminar series. People want to know about mental health and mental well-being. And I think, you and I have spent a lot of time in the workers' comp space, right? That didn't always reflect mental health. And so wanted to make sure, and you and I talked about this in preparation for today, that we talked about, that focus on trauma-informed care and how we can help workers and employers promote mental health safety. So I'm gonna have you talk a little more about that.
Oh, thanks, Kimberly. And it's a great question, because workplace safety does encompass both the physical and mental well-being. If you include mental health, organizations can offer things like stress management programs or promoting work-life balance, like you shared before, access to counseling services, and create open and a supportive environment. I like to look at the example during the pandemic when a number of organizations created work from home environments or hybrid circumstances just due to the circumstances and the hazards associated with being in, in a close environment. But we had people begin to suffer from isolation, even poor productivity, and it just wasn't in the divorce rate or the relationship or other types of problems that occurred. This was a reflection of the actions, that companies took based on the circumstances. But nevertheless, we had to be, aware that mental health is as much a part of, workplace safety as it is the physical. So I think those are just, we've had some examples, clearly tell us where we need to spend time, both the physical and the mental well-being.
Yeah, absolutely. And we do have resources in the chat for mental health safety in the workplace. And I'd just like to thank Kristen Dahl, our HDI subject matter expert for mental health, who provided me with a lot of those resources. So those are available to take a deeper dive into that workplace safety. And I love that example that you shared, Steve, about the pandemic and people being isolated. And, I hate to say that there are silver linings to something like a pandemic, because a lot of people lost lives and homes and jobs, but I think it made us look at mental health and wellness much differently than we did prior to the pandemic. So that example was really hit home for me. So thank you.
Yeah, great point. I think the other things that we have seen, and depends on the type of employment, different parts of the country have experienced smash and grab thefts from stores, other types of events. We've had active shooter events. We've had many psychological trauma events that have occurred in the workplace. And, we have tended not to think of the workplace as a place as where it's been mostly physical, but we do have events that have occurred that we have to be very quick to react to providing mental health care. And it's even when we do layoffs or other types of events that can cause, trauma or pain or otherwise to work environments. So it's not just workplace safety, but it's other sort of moral, ethical, and legal issues that occur within a workplace, above and beyond what we might consider just typical workplace safety. So.
Right. And I think that goes back to, you were talking about who's accountable. And I've seen a lot more, in the workplace and other environments where we hear, if you see something, say something, right? And I think that goes back to people being accountable for their own safety and the safety of those around them in the workplace as well. So those are good examples for us to think about and consider too.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. So as far as key thoughts or what an organization needs to do to create a safety culture, and I think, you've touched on some of this, but can you give us more information about organizations that you've helped really create that safety culture and how they've done that?
Yes, and we'll talk a little bit about this later on in some lessons learned. We're giving a little bit of preview to what's up and coming.
Okay.
But I'd like to say that, there's a key factor in creating a safety culture. And a good example of this, if you haven't read the story of Paul O'Neill, he served as the CEO of Alcoa from 1987 to 1999. And he had a very unique way of leading that organization. As a matter of fact, at his very first board meeting, when he was announced as the CEO, he told the board that there was one thing that they were going to focus on, and that was workplace safety and the protection of the workforce. And they, of course, were surprised and, uh, you know, not really on board, because they wanted to hear things about profitability and production and all the other things that go along with being, quote, a CEO and a successful company. However, this one-sided focus, if you want to call it, on integrating safety into all the operations, it was just became a core value at the company. It was as if that was the sole, purpose of that organization. And of course, during his tenure, he reduced the lost workday injury rate by 90%. And it was a pretty dramatic change in the culture of the company. But it wasn't just the fact that they became, had a terrific safety record. They became incredibly profitable during his period of time. It was all reflective of that incredible, focus that he put on safety. And you find that in other organizations that put that focus on their staff and becoming a safe environment. And all of the other things, all the studies that, that have been done over the years in risk management, all show that there are huge benefits to putting safety, as what we might consider a core part of your culture. And we could talk a lot about all the success studies in the country, but we don't have all that time. There are, if you like reading, there are companies that every year there are 10 or 12 companies that get voted by peers as the safest companies in America. And if you read the stories about these companies, not only are they safe, but they have great, profitability and production returns. So.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, that's very interesting. So it sounds like there's a correlation with those organizations between safety and productivity and profitability. So
Yes.
good to hear. Well, I know we also talked about, you say it starts at the top, like with the leader of Alcoa, and goes throughout the organization. And, in my time as a case manager, I know those frontline supervisors really were the ones who had a lot to do with safety and people, returning to work in a safe manner or staying at work safely after they had been ill or injured. And sometimes just the, terminology that's used can be key for an organization, for somebody to stay at work or return to work. And, I'm always an advocate of using terms like, what are somebody's capacities to stay at work or return to work versus their restrictions. And I had a supervisor one time who, mistakenly, very innocently said, asked a worker, oh, when you go back to the doctor, do you think you'll return full duty? And that worker then interpreted that they could only return full duty, which was not the case. Just the supervisor was trying to plan. And so that kind of impacted that person's return to work. And I know even using the term light duty now, it could be a misnomer, because sometimes return to works don't involve changing a physical demand of the job. It could be changing the shift to accommodate ongoing treatment or a medication regimen, or allowing someone to take lunch at an alternative time to attend an AA meeting or a counseling session. And I know you've talked about that with the actively caring culture. And so I don't know if this is a good time to talk about it, or if we're going to talk about it a little bit later.
Oh, great point. The whole, aspect of terminology and where does that fit into your culture. And, I never advocate for words like the word claim or claimant. If a
Mm-hmm.
person is injured, they're an injured worker. Most of the people on the insurance side and the other sides of the business will use that terminology. Or when a person is injured on the job and they call the insurance company or the TPA or whatever, the first question is, what's your claim number? It shouldn't be that. It should be, tell me your name and the company you work for. So we have all sorts of ways. I love the fact that you brought up the aspect of terminology. A lot of companies will write their incident investigations and say things like, the employee alleges they fell down the stairs, or the employee alleges. Why not just say the employee states
Right.
or some other term that doesn't create a barrier, between you and them? And that all goes into culture. So I'll
Yeah.
talk about it in a little bit, but I know we're a little bit short on time, so we can move on to the next one if you'd like.
Okay, we're going to talk about a couple myths, and we know that people heal from illness and injury incrementally, and really getting back to normal daily life, including work, as part of that process. And we've talked about how managers play a key role in that, in the recovery process, when they involve the employee, healthcare provider in that return to work planning, and provide those tools and resources that they can make an informed decision. And one of the ways that we promote at Retain is those functional job analysis and options for transitional duty. So, we've talked about ensuring employees are not totally disengaged from work. You gave that great example about how that, happened inadvertently during the pandemic, but other ways that I think we can dispel this myth or make sure this myth doesn't happen is have those transitional duty tasks and involve the people that need to be involved. So I'm gonna have you elaborate a little bit more on that from your experience.
Well, isolation can hinder recovery for sure. And you've got to get to a place where you have a gradual reintegration into daily activities with obviously proper accommodations. And all of that can promote healing and maintain a sense of normalcy, because when someone is hurt or injured, their whole life can be disrupted, along with their relationships with family, their relationships with work. So bringing all this back, reintegrating into what we call, these daily activities, it's a
Mhm.
it's necessary for the success. And you see that in most cases. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute too.
Okay. We do have a question from my colleague, Derek. He is asking, how do you think workplace safety plays into turnover rates with some employers? Do you think job seekers are also considering how safe a potential workplace is in addition to other factors? That's a great question, especially right now with all of the retention issues that employers are seeing in our country.
That's a really good question. And I will just have to answer that it depends on the industry and it depends on the type of workers. If you take frontline workers, perhaps laborers or others in the construction industry or something along those lines, many of those people will sacrifice safety because they need the job. They need to put food on their plate. They need to be able to support their families. So safety per se, although they may not feel comfortable with it, will move ahead anyway. And we see lots of companies where this happens and certain industries. However, if you want to look at industries where people have the chance to more self-actualize in their jobs, have a higher ambition, then maybe they view their companies, you know, uh, having a lack of integrity if they don't have a good safety program or teach their, or treat their workforce in a particular way. So I think it's going to depend on the
Mhm.
industry, the level of employee, the work that's being done before we can put a blanket on that. So I hope I didn't, I don't want to be, a real middle of the line on that, but I do think there's some big factors that go into determining how hard. We work a lot with agriculture companies. We have over 250 ag companies. Do I think that the employees think about safety? Yes. But I also think that they go to work every day knowing that there is inherent risk to their job, and they
Mhm.
do it because they need to support their families. And so safety doesn't become as important. I'm sorry, just the
You're
way that it
getting a
is.
you're getting a thumbs up. So you're
Okay.
you're speaking you're speaking our language. So
Okay.
and that's a great, I mean, really, honestly, you've made me think a little differently about that too, in that it really is it's gonna vary based on where the
Yeah.
worker is. So thank
Yes.
you. Great question, Derek, and great response, Steve. Thank you very much. So we're going to go ahead and move on. And one of the other myths is most employees want to stay out of work as long as possible. And, ways that we can avoid that is set the expectation of stay at work and return to work in your workplace. That'll also go a long way to help with the retention of your employees. In the work process with supervisors, let them know you'll support them if you're a leader in your company to help find ways to temporarily modify their job or work site. And, make sure that you provide supervisor training as well to help in that process. And the other thing that I really advocate for is make sure you communicate your stay at work and return to work policy at onboarding, in your employee handbook, during open enrollment, and as an added benefit during open enrollment when someone goes on leave. And I've even worked with companies that they'll put people who have been successful in transitional work tasks in their newsletter, of course, with that person's permission, just to show how that person successfully came back to work in that transitional process. So I've said more than I need to. I'm going to let you share some with that, Steve.
No, thank you, Kimberly. And I think most companies have a good feeling about their employees, that they want to work hard and that they want to return to work. I think there is, if you look at the industry as a whole, maybe 10% of work comp cases, or those that are on injury, might be considered either quote fraudulent or malingering. So it's a misnomer that people want to stay out of work as long as possible. That becomes, if your senior management thinks that employees are trying to rip them off, or trying to find a way, shortcuts to all the work, or again, that's going to be a problem in an organization. But the reality is that it's a very small percentage of people who might want to stay out of work for longer periods of time. Most people want to resume their lives, get back to their normalcy, and carry on and support their families or themselves. So
Absolutely.
yeah.
So we've dispelled those myths, and we're going to wrap up today with you sharing a couple or three of your greatest lessons learned for achieving workplace safety, and how can we as employers, workforce professionals, workers, healthcare professionals help promote safety in the workplace.
Well, do we have a couple minutes, or I think
We
are we
do.
close to
Yeah,
the end? Okay.
absolutely.
I'll give two so that we can wrap up pretty quickly. I'd say number one, and we've listed some of these in the book, but I would say that number one, that organizations are run by the cultural rules of the workplace. And I think just let that resonate for a moment, because although we think of the economic rules and that's what drives a company, the real work is done by the people. It's run by the cultural rules of the workplace. And the example I like to give is, if any of you had to drive to work today, or you're going to spend some time on the highway and the speed limit says that it's 65 on the highway, are you going 65? Are you going 68? Are you going 70 or 75? I'm not sure. I'm not judging you. I'm sure everybody on this call sticks it at 65. But if you
Don't
are
ask
going,
my husband.
I won't ask your husband.
Okay.
If you're going 70, why are you going 70 when you have a driver's license? You know there's highway patrol on the road. There's signs that say you shouldn't go more than 65. There's the potential for a negative citation against you, but yet you go 70 or 75. That's because the culture of the road in that moment is dictating what the speed is. So although you have all these quote safety rules in place, policies, procedures, highway patrol officers making observations, you still aren't capable of going 65 because the culture is telling you it's 70 or 75 or 80. I'm not sure what it is, depends on where you live. So we have to remember that the cultural rules drive a workplace, and that's something to be key on. I'd say the second lesson goes back to the 1920s, and that is the Hawthorne effect. With some of you may be familiar with that, and that is someone upstairs cares. And I don't know how to put it any easier than that. And in these studies that were done at, in the 1920s to early 1930s. Elton Mayo went into companies and wanted to figure out a way to improve productivity. And so back then, people worked 6 days a week, Monday through Saturday, 12 to 16 hours a day. So they started introducing different aspects of changes to the job, a break midday, a lunch break, a paid lunch, 2 breaks a day, 6 breaks a day, all different things. Productivity kept going up and up and up. And then they stopped all of it and went back to the regular pace that they had been, the 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, no change. And productivity had increased. Injuries had decreased. Why? They learned later on it wasn't just the fact that all these changes had been made, it's the fact that they had had an observer there, someone asking them, how's your day going? How's the work going? Hey, by the way, Joe, I heard that your wife was, going to have a baby, blah, blah, blah. So it was not the fact that all these changes to the physical sort of scientific part of the job, it was the fact that people were listening to them and they were interested in them and they were paying attention to them. So those are probably the 2 greatest lessons learned, and I'll leave it at that because I know our time is important. So I hope
Well,
that helps.
absolutely. Those are great examples. And I just want to thank you for joining us and sharing your expertise today. And the examples that you gave where you knocked it out of the park. And obviously your 2 decades of experience really, I appreciate you sharing that. And circling back to your comment about Retain Kentucky, if you have someone who is eligible, for those of you on the call, send them our way. We would love to help them be accountable for their workplace safety. And this information is available on our Retain Kentucky media, as well as our website at kyretain.org. And with that, I would just like to say thanks to everybody for joining us